The San Andreas Fault in Western California, USA. Here, two of the gigantic moving plates which carry the Earth's continents are pressing together and sometimes slipping, causing movements which range from slight tremors to devastating earthquakes. Watercourses like this one once ran straight across the fault. Over many years, relative movement between the great plates has displaced it, as we can see. Vivid evidence for the theory of plate tectonics, the idea of continental drift. And here near Newcastle-on-Tyne, northeastern England, evidence of a different kind. Dr. D.H. Tarling of Newcastle University talks about the magnetism which we find in rocks exposed in this quarry face.
Now, when we collect these rocks from the exposure up on the top there, we can look at their magnetization in samples like this. And what we find in these is that the magnetization is quite different to what we have in present-day sediments in Britain. What we find with these is that the magnetization, in fact, is not very steep as it is in Britain today, but is quite shallow.
This transparent model of the Earth has a magnet inside simulating the Earth's magnetic field. These compass needles indicate the angle of dip in that field at various degrees of latitude. Here, at the present latitude of the British Isles, the angle of dip should be fairly large. This core of rock from the quarry should show magnetization in this direction. But it doesn't. The angle of dip is much smaller, like this. Now this is the angle of dip expected at the equator. Now when a rock is formed, the influence of the Earth's field on the alignment of magnetic substances is locked into it. So when this rock was formed, it must have been near the equator, in the area, say, where the Sahara Desert is today.
Now, if we look at these sediments immediately beneath where we took that sample, we've got these beautiful sort of dunes here with all of the bedding cutting across, exactly the same as you get in dunes in desert areas today. And the grains themselves are all rounded by the wind, exactly the same as you get in the Sahara today.
So the magnetic evidence suggests that where we now have all this sand beneath green English fields was once arid desert near the equator. There's yet another kind of evidence for the idea of moving continents. Professor Edwin Colbert again, the distinguished American paleontologist.
The continents as we know them were once together in a supercontinent, and then they broke apart and drifted to their present positions. Now there's a great deal of physical evidence to corroborate that theory based on our studies of the ocean floors and the continents themselves. And one line of evidence perhaps can be shown by this picture that I did for one of my papers several years ago. Don't pay attention to the letters there. What I want to bring out here now are the outlines of the continents based on the continental blocks, not on the strand lines, which are shown here in light lines, but on the continental blocks themselves at about 1,000 fathoms. And you see in these heavy lines here, this is South America, Africa, and you can see that they fit very closely together. And of course, here we have Antarctica fitting in here, Australia fitting here, Peninsular India fitting here, Madagascar here. Now, Sir Edward Bullard of Cambridge University made computer studies of these fits, as they're called, and those studies showed that those fits are too good to be accidental. They must have significance. The question is, do the fossils corroborate the physical evidence for these fits of the continents? Well, Antarctica is a key region in that respect because at the present time it is isolated, completely isolated from the other continents. And if we should find fossils on Antarctica that are related to fossils in other areas, then there's good reason to think that this theory or this idea of continental drift and plate tectonics is truly valid. For many years, I'd hoped that somebody would go to Antarctica and look for fossils, and as luck would have it, I went down there about 10 years ago. to search for fossils, and sure enough, we did find fossils. Now, here's where these little letters and dots come in. We found fossils here, about 350 miles from the South Pole, which you see in this location here, and these fossils were identical with fossils that had been found previously in South Africa and in peninsular India, as you see here.
This is a reconstruction of the early amphibian Lystrosaurus, based on fossil evidence. Let's concentrate on the skull, and in particular on this region here. This is a fossilized Lystrosaurus skull found in South Africa, with the region in question painted white for clarity. And here's a portion of fossilized Lystrosaurus skull found in the Antarctic. The blackened area corresponds exactly with the white area on the African specimen. The animal had small tusks like this. They're present on the South African fossil and also on the one found in the Antarctic. These animals must once have lived and died on the same part of the Earth's surface. When the supercontinent drifted apart, the remains were separated, so that one fossil turned up in Africa, another in the polar region. The evidence suggests then that 200 million years ago there was this enormous supercontinent. 180 million years ago it was separating up. By 65 million years ago the map was this, and here's the Earth as we know it today. Many features of animal and plant distribution, past and present, can be explained by continental drift. For instance, we find fossil trees in the now arid desert of northern Arizona, showing that the climate was once much moister. Great earth movements caused by shifting plates produced the high Sierras and the Rockies. They brought arid conditions which, possibly, extinguished those giant dinosaurs, an example of how animal and plant populations have been exposed to changing selective influences over geological time. The concept of continental drift has a further relevance to the study of evolution. The unique mammal life of Australia, its marsupials, like the kangaroos for example, is accounted for by its isolation long before placental mammals evolved elsewhere. Isolation is an important factor in the process of evolution. Can we still detect the effects of isolation, even on a very much smaller scale, going on today? Let's take a look at some much smaller islands.
I never dreamt that islands about 50 or 60 miles apart, and most of them in sight of each other, formed of precisely the same rocks, placed under a quite similar climate, rising to nearly equal height, would be differently tenanted. But I obtained sufficient materials to establish this most remarkable fact in the distribution of organic beings.
Charles Darwin's words from his diary of the Journal of the Beagle, in which he describes his famous visit to the Galapagos Islands. Professor R.J. Berry of University College London.
We're not on the Galapagos here. We're in a very different part of the world. We're in fact on Fair Isle, which is just about the most isolated inhabited island in Britain. Fair Isle itself lies 83 miles north of the Scottish mainland. It lies halfway in between two groups of islands, the Orkney Islands and the Shetland Islands. Both these groups of islands have different sizes of island and different animals and plants, both on the different islands and between the different groups. And it's these different animals that we shall be looking at. Why have they come to be different from forms on other islands and the forms we're more familiar with on the mainland?
Here on Fair Isle, traps have been set to catch specimens of the long-tailed field mouse Apodemus sylvaticus, which lives on the less inhabited part of the island. It's a member of a separate race of the animals found here on Fair Isle. Compare it with Apodemus trapped in southern England, the much smaller mouse on the right. This island race is on the whole bigger than our mainland mice, and there are other differences. Evidence suggests that the Fair Isle mice, that's one on the right, are not descended from our mainland field mice on the left. The field mice populations on a number of our small northern islands come from Scandinavian ancestors introduced accidentally by man. And the mouse populations differ slightly from island to island. The skin of a Fair Isle mouse and the skin of a field mouse from Fula, there are slight differences in colour and size. This is the skin of a field mouse from Rum. Again, measurements of many animals show that field mice on this island share certain differences from, say, those on this island, St. Kilda. Whenever a small number of animals colonize an island, they carry only some of the genes present in the entire ancestral population, so they'll be different from that ancestral population. Natural selection on the island will act upon these differences. For example, the Rum Apodemus has a greyer underside compared with a specimen of Apodemus from Kilda. Each colour must have been for some reason selected for on its particular island. Isolation of separate populations of the same species on different islands has led to different races. Evolution has occurred. We leave Fair Isle to look at the effects of isolation on populations of another kind of animal which we find on the Orkney Islands not far south. Traps have been laid on Orkney mainland for the Orkney vole, another animal which Professor Berry investigates. This one's been sprung. And there he is. These animals are this time a quite different species from the common voles we find in mainland Britain. They're descended from a vole widespread in continental Europe, again introduced accidentally by traders sailing to our offshore islands from southern Europe. We fly to another of the Orkneys, to Westray. This is typical vole country. There's the entrance to one of their runs in the long grass. And here's a Westray vole, again descended from the same Mediterranean ancestor as the vole from mainland Orkney. But detailed examinations of many specimens show that the two populations have certain differences. The Westray voles on the left, the mainland Orkney animals on the right. Here are skins of voles from 4 different Orkney islands. The differences between them are not immediately apparent, but one thing is clear. They're all much larger than the eastern Mediterranean voles they're descended from. There's a specimen. And from the Guernsey voles, which are of the same continental species. On these northern islands, larger animals lose heat less quickly than smaller ones, and they don't have to be very small to escape from ground predators. Once more, animal populations have, in isolation, evolved differences from the ancestral stock. Living things must have the capacity to transmit variations to their progeny if they're to be capable of evolving new subspecies, new forms. Let's take the common house mouse as an example and test it for this genetic variability. Each of these tubes contains tissue fluid from a different house mouse. A separate square of absorbent paper is soaked with each sample and fitted into a slot in a sheet of starch gel. This is the technique called electrophoresis, which reveals differences in proteins between individual animals or plants, which may not otherwise be apparent. Kept cold to prevent breakdown of the proteins we're examining, a potential difference is applied across the gel. Different proteins migrate through the gel, traveling different distances in a given time, according to differences in their precise chemical structures. After some time, the gel is removed and stained. Each of these columns represents proteins from a different mouse. You can see that the tissue fluid from certain mice contain proteins not present in others. Now, proteins are produced by the action of the genes, as we shall see in a later film. So there must be differences in the genes between certain of the mice. You can see, for example, that one particular protein is absent in these individuals, which must be genetically different from the others. Electrophoresis shows that there is a great deal of genetic variability amongst individuals of a particular species. Laboratory experiments involving selective breeding from wild mice, like this one, make manifest the tremendous amount of genetic variability available. Look at some of these mice, all differing from the wild type by very few genes which produce effects we can see. There are differences in pigmentation and in many other features. These mice, for example, all have kinky tails. When a few individuals are isolated, say on an island, any special genetic characteristics they possess which increase the number of their surviving offspring will be selected and become commoner in succeeding generations. Hence the island field mice and voles we looked at earlier. Here on Fair Isle, a lot of work has been done on yet another group of animals. Arctic skuas breed above the cliffs. These birds are found in two different morphs or phases, pale and dark, as you can see in these two. The dark phase behind, the pale phase in front on the left. On Fair Isle, about a fifth of the birds are pale. Further south there are fewer. Further north, towards the Arctic, there are more of the pale phase. The reason is that in male Arctic skuas, the gene causing paleness also produces aggressiveness. Now, the female birds court the males before they mate. This takes longer with the light-coloured males, since they're at first very aggressive towards the females. So eggs are laid and chicks hatched later amongst the pale birds, which is an advantage further north where spring comes late. The dark males are less aggressive, so pairing and egg-laying comes earlier and the chicks hatch earlier amongst the dark birds which predominate in the more southerly latitudes when spring is earlier. This gradation in the frequency of one form with distance is called a cline and produces here genetic differences determined by behaviour. In the north, the pale birds, in the south, the dark. The two phases can in fact interbreed. The bird on the left is an intermediate between the two forms. We don't have two species here. We do, however, have a mechanism producing genetical differences, and these must be an early stage in the divergence of populations. Of course, there are many examples of variation and selection which we don't understand. There are many cliff-nesting birds on these northern islands. This is at Westray, one of the Orkneys. These are common guillemots. Look at the bird on the right. It has what looks like white spectacles around its eyes. This is called the bridled form and is inherited as a recessive character. Here's the normal form without spectacles and the bridled form again. As we move north, more bridled guillemots are found. It isn't yet known what determines this particular cline. But one thing is clear. Here again, as with the other examples in this film, we are observing a fundamental aspect of the evolutionary process: selection in action.